So, in terms of number of users, we estimate that there are about 183 million of cannabis users in the last year, so annual users. And this is about 3.8, 3.9% of the global population, and has been relatively stable. And as you see, it's much higher than any other drug. Here, if you can distinguish, because I know it's very far, here, they are the estimates for the prevalence, the rate of use in the last year, and the number of people who use cannabis in the last year at global level and in different regions. And what we see that in Western Europe is twice as high than the global average, but it's still two times lower than North America and Oceania. So this is basically one of the highest, but not so much higher. Here, this is a ranking of cannabis use in terms of the different drugs. So the prevalence for the last year. And we see that in most of the countries around the world, this is drug number 1. But in some countries, it's drug number 2 or 3 also. So this is something I said yesterday, but here you have it represented. Here we have the estimated number of cannabis users and also the Cannabis Use Perception Index. So we ask the countries every year whether they think that there is an increase or not in cannabis use. It's supposed to be based on multiple indicators. I say suppose because it's very difficult to check that. And we see there is a limited increase in cannabis use worldwide. This is global level. Now here, this is about cannabis use in 15, 16-year-old students in Europe. So this is the ESPAT survey, and we can compare the two last the two last surveys in 2011 and 2015. At European level, there was a very slight decrease from 17 to 16% of these students, this age range, who reported they have used cannabis in their lifetime, because we don't ask about last year, because basically it's more or less the same in this age range. Now, in Sweden, as you see, there is also a slight decrease, but the Swedish prevalence is nearly twice less the European prevalence. And what I put also in 2015, you see, is the prevalence in the United States, just as an indication. And you see that it's twice more than in Europe. So just for you to understand a bit where we are. Here we see the same data, but represented to look at trends, basically, and also levels. And you see that all the green squares are for countries where the prevalence has decreased, basically, between the 2011 and 2015 in 15, 16 years old. And those that are closest to zero, of course, are those with the least prevalence, the lowest prevalence. When we look at the difference between boys and girls, on the top right, we see that there may be a convergence now in 2015 of the prevalence between boys and girls. Boys have always been higher than girls, but I think we need to see that, because if you look at 1995, which is when the ESPAT survey started, it was perhaps a bit closer to. So I'm not sure. I mean, we need to see. And I put also Sweden so that you see that here. It seems to be relatively flat, but perhaps it depends on the scale too, and you might be able to contribute to that better. Now, here we have at global level, the distribution of the people who are in drug treatment by primary drug for being in drug treatment. And you see that at least at global level, 39% are in drug treatment for cannabis as a primary drug, and 33% for opioids. Now, what we need also to say is that there may be a primary drug for entering drug treatment, but in many, many cases, there are other drugs that are being consumed, secondary drugs, whatever. So this may be also misleading, but it's interesting to see that, I mean, one wouldn't expect this. However, when we look at primary drug of concern among people in drug treatment by region, we see that cannabis is the highest in Africa, in North America, in Latin America, and in Oceania. So these are the green bars. And in Europe, it comes second after opiates. In Europe, it has been increasing in the last few years. When we look at health-related harm, so both the number of deaths that are related to drug use disorders and the number of healthy years of life which are lost because of disability or premature death because of drug use disorders. So these are the two graphs. And we see that cannabis is comparatively very small compared to other drugs. This is the smallest of the bar in blue. In blue, you have all the bars related to substances. And in red, this is about hepatitis C. And in green, this is about HIV. So in terms of deaths, zero, basically, that are attributed to cannabis use disorders, or very little. And in terms of years of healthy life loss on the right, so it's also very little compared to other drugs. I mean, the estimates that we have. Here, we see that there is an increase across the board. It's not depending on the drug, if all drugs, in the number of years of healthy life lost because of drug use disorders for every drug. And we see also that there's an increase both for men and for women. And for cannabis, we see that as for other drugs, there is more problems in men, more cannabis use disorders estimated in men than in women in terms of number of this that is lost. Now, if I go to supply and we look at the distribution of the drug seizures cases, so the cases, the interception. We have data for about 2.4 million cases for the last year available, 2015. And here you see very clearly that more than half of the cases are related to cannabis, and most of them, 2/3, are related to herbal products. And the rest is resin and other products, such as oil and other products. But these are very minimal. Now, this was in terms of number of cases. Now, when we look at quantities of drugs seized in the last year for which data are available, we see that cannabis is the most seized drug worldwide, 7.3 thousand tons. And the next, I mean, the one who ranks second is cocaine, with nearly 10 times less. So there is really a big difference. Now, in terms of what is seized as a cannabis product, most of it is herbal product. 4 times more herb is seized than resin. And herb is 6,000 tons are seized every year, and for resin is 1.5 thousand tons. Here we have a representation of drug seizures in terms of quantity, again, for different drugs, or groups of drugs. And cannabis is the highest, but what we see, that you have two different scales. I warn you. So on the left is a scale for cannabis, because it's really much more, and on the right is a scale for the other drug. So for cannabis, has been relatively stable, basically, in the last years, and also the distribution between herb and resin is also very much stable, and which is not the case for some of the other drugs. Now, there is no estimate of the cultivation and the production of cannabis in the world, neither by country, in fact. This is a plant that is cultivated nearly everywhere, except perhaps where it's really too cold, like in Siberia or the North Pole. And when we look at different indicators, we estimate, at least the countries report to us, that there would be production in 135 of them. So this is quite many. And when we look at the different indirect indicators, in fact, because we don't have direct indicators, about the eradication of cannabis cultivation sites, plants seized, also sites where there is drying, things like that, we see it would seem that most of, at least the main area where, the main production area of cannabis in the world would be in the Americas. It's very difficult to go a bit, to dig a bit more into that. What is certain is that it's cultivated in every region in the world, and most of the trafficking is intra-regional. So it's being produced and trafficked and consumed basically within the same region. I'm talking about the global regions, so they're quite big, but this is also the case for sub-regions. Perhaps the only exception is, for example, resin, cannabis resin that is being produced in Morocco for the Western European market. So here there is an import into European, West Europe of products from another region. So these are the quantities seized. This is just long term of what I showed you later. I mean, I said in the last few years has been relatively stable. That said, if we compare to 20 years ago, we nearly have twice more seized. It's very difficult to know whether it's because law enforcement is more effective in seizing or whether there's more being trafficked compared to 20 years ago. There's also always this issue with the law enforcement indicators. Now, where trafficking is happening, for most, for herb, for cannabis herb, most of the seizures are taking place in the United States and in Mexico. So, as I said, North America, where the main area of production. And for resin, in Spain. Spain is on the route between Morocco and Western European markets. Also in Pakistan and in Morocco, of course. Now, here is another representation. Then you can see the big locations in terms of herbal cannabis seizures. So mostly in North America, Latin America, and Africa. And here also by region, we can see the evolution, and some things are changing. So for long, the seizures of cannabis herb worldwide were mostly in North America, but this is declining since 2010, and also afterwards the legalization of recreational cannabis in some states. So there is a changing now in the repartition of the trafficking. Sorry, yes. Yep. Now, if I move to resin, we see there are different production areas, obviously. So I mentioned Morocco, the main producer for Europe and also for North Africa. There is also a lot of production going on in Afghanistan, which is the main producer for Pakistan and Iran, and other countries in the region, of course. And there are smaller markets in the Middle East, with Lebanon exporting to Egypt, and also some production in Egypt on the Sinai. And here we see also what has happened in terms of seizures. Seizures are an indirect indicator of trafficking. At least this is how we consider it. And we see that West Europe has been declining in terms of seizures of resin. Has been declining, and this is because there has been a shift in Europe in the consumer markets between resin towards herb. It's not a full shift; it's a partial shift that started perhaps 10 years ago, and now there's more and more herbal products that are being produced in Europe and for consumption within the European market. And for the first time in 2015, the largest seizures by region are in the Near and Middle East. So these are data on the European Union on cannabis, a number of data, but what I wanted to highlight in particular is what's happening with the potency of cannabis. So the cannabis potency is the concentration in THC. THC is a psychoactive substance of natural cannabis, and we see that there has been a marked increase in the potency of cannabis in both resin and herbal products. And this is, so as you see, I mean, between 2006 and 2015, so over 10 years, is like 90% increase in the potency of resin and 80% in herb. So it's quite a marked increase. And this is correlated also, I mentioned before, with an increase in the European Union in the number of people in treatment for cannabis as their primary drug. So something is happening. It seems that perhaps more cannabis use disorders that are or people that are referred to treatment with such problems. What we see also is that the cannabis market in Europe and probably elsewhere, but this is where we have the most data, is changing. There is more and more, it's becoming more diversified. There is a lot of, a larger number of products. And with some of the genetic modifications that have been happening in the last 10, 20 years, we now have some products, in particular herbal products, and for example, Sinsemilla, which are maybe very high in THC, but what is perhaps more worrying is that they're also very low in another cannabinoid, which is called cannabidiol, CBD, which it has the property to basically being an antipsychotic. So this is a cannabinoid that counter-effect, in fact, the action of THC. And what we see is that the cannabis that was on the market like 20 years ago had a sort of, I don't know if it's fair, but has a fair balance between the two cannabinoids, THC and CBD. And now, because there have been some genetic modification to select plants, basically materials that is higher in THC, this was against plants that were high in CBD. So at the end, we have a material that may pose much more health issues for the consumers. So this may be related, of course, to the increase in the treatment for cannabis in Europe that we see now. Now, if I move to the legalization of recreational cannabis, let me take my notes because I have many here. Yes, yesterday I showed this slide, so I don't know if all of you were there. But so now, for the last 3 years, we are trying to look at what's happening in the different member states in the world who have been legalizing or have been regulating recreational cannabis or cannabis for recreational use. So up to now, this has been happening in the United States and in Uruguay. In Uruguay, the new regulation, the provisions are being implemented gradually. So we don't have much data now to evaluate the impact or to see what's happening, even to understand how it's being implemented, because it's not fully implemented. In the United States, now there are 9 jurisdictions where the recreational cannabis is allowed. These are 8 states and one district, the District of Columbia. And what is important to mention is that in all of them now, but except the District of Columbia, there is the possibility to get licenses, or they are in the process of developing licensing schemes to enable for-profit companies to produce, to market, and to sell a wide range of cannabis products, like any other consumer goods, but with some different regulation. What is extremely very important to highlight, and I've not prepared a slide about that, but this is in the World Drug Report in a table in the annex, the last year we published, is that the implementation of the legalization and the different rules, they are all different between these 9 jurisdictions. And so this may have a completely different impact also in terms of public security, in terms of public health, in terms of the markets, etc. So access is different, the outlets to the restrictions, I don't know, any control. The taxing system too is extremely different. So, yeah. And I think we need some time also because it takes time to implement. Now, what is important to, and I said yesterday, is that, and this is the yellow and the blue here on the map, is that all the states that had legalized cannabis in 2012 and just after, so the 9 jurisdictions, they had prior measures to allow for medical use of cannabis. And now we have 29 states in the United States where there are comprehensive laws that allow the production, the sale, and the use of cannabis for medical conditions. And this also is implemented in different ways, and we know that in some states there may be a diversion, and there may be, the medical cannabis may be also catering for recreational uses. It also depends how it is dispensed, in special dispensaries or not, with prescription, etc. Here, I know it's very small, but we wanted to put on one slide basically the development of the cannabis legislation in the United States. I think the slides may be available to you later on. So between 1905 and 1970, there has been a process with different acts, etc., of criminalization of cannabis in the United States, so until 1970. And then in the years 1973, 1978, so during the 5-6 years, there was a decriminalization, not everywhere, but in many places, of cannabis use for recreational purposes. And then this was put on hold during the Reagan administration in the 80s. But as of 1996, there is also decriminalization starting again here and there. And it was followed by legalized medical cannabis in California and many other states. So then there was the starting of the medical cannabis. And then it was followed in 2012 with the first states, Washington and Colorado, to legalize recreational cannabis. And then the other states came in 2014 and 2016. So this was the result of the last polls. So as you say, there is a sort of progression, basically. And what's happening is different in every state. So it's extremely complex. Different for for decriminalization, for medical cannabis, and for legalization of recreational cannabis. So here on the left graph, we see that the use of cannabis has remained rather stable at global level. Also in the European Union. The European Union is in blue. And in Australia, the global is the red, and Australia is the green. But has been increasing in the United States. So this I also mentioned yesterday. And you see also what's happening in Europe on the right, in young people. So this is the SPAT survey. So it's relatively stable now in all types of group of users in Europe. So this was a bit to give the global perspective. Now, in terms of the United States, when we look at the last 15 years, we see that there is an increase on the left. This is a left graph, an increase in the use of cannabis. There is also an increase in the passive availability of cannabis, and an increase in the perception of that cannabis leads to no harm. So a decrease in the risk perception, basically, of cannabis. It's better to say it like that, even if it's not what is represented. And what is striking is that there has been an acceleration of this increase from 2008 onwards. This was just after 2007, when 12 states had measures in place allowing medical cannabis, basically. So the production and the sale and distribution of medical cannabis use. Now, so as I said yesterday, so this increase at state level, but also in at the United States level, national level, but also in different states, has occurred in an environment of a decrease of risk perception, and an environment where some states had permitted the medical use of cannabis, and there were extensive media coverage, and a lot of state-level debates also around the medical use, but also around the legalization of recreational use. So this created a sort of climate, perhaps changing in norms, and we believe led into more consumption, more use of cannabis. We can see also that the increase in cannabis use is particularly evident in heavy users. This is the pink light, so daily and near daily use. This is a bit, and also on the right, in older, I mean 26 and older, it's not very old, but still, in older population groups, but we will come back to that. Now here, we have done two graphs. One on the left with what has been happening in terms of this increase in use in the states that are allowing cannabis legalization and for recreational use. And then on the left, what has been happening in the states not allowing. And the light blue line in both graphs is for the United States at national level, so the national average. And we see there is clearly a more marked increase in the states that have legalized compared to those that have not. And the most marked increase is in Colorado. This is the pink line, the light pink on the left. Colorado is one of the two first states that have legalized, and this is where there is the least market restriction now for recreational cannabis. There's really a free market approach there. But the states that have not allowed are also increasing, but this is at a lower pace. Here we see that it's mostly in older age range that are affected by increase for the moment. I say for the moment because in people that are less than 26, we don't see an increase yet. I say yet because we need to see. Now, in terms of legalization, in all the state, in all jurisdictions in the United States where recreational cannabis is allowed, this is for 21 and older. In Uruguay, is 18. So we need to see. We need to see if there is also a sort of a spreading, basically, of the use if young people are getting cannabis through others, even if they are not allowed in cannabis shops, etc. Something to follow very properly. Here we are looking at cannabis use disorders. So it's not about use in the last year, it's really about disorders. And we see, this is the blue line, that they have remained rather stable, that daily and near daily use has markedly increased, and that this increase, as I said before, is seen in all the age group. And so we put the United States average and also California, just as a comparison, but we see the trends are quite similar. Here we see on the changes in the perceived availability of cannabis. So when we ask people about, do you think it's difficult, rather difficult, neither easy, very easy to obtain cannabis, and I don't know if the question here is in the last 24 hours. It depends, I think, on the surveys. I can't remember that. But basically, this is this type of question. So it's about perceived availability of cannabis. And I say perceived because it's not really about an experience. It's more about an attitude here. And also about the risk perception of whether cannabis is pose a risk or not, basically. And we see that in terms of availability and use, they have been basically moving together over the years, since 1975 to now. Even if now availability is, availability seems decreasing, whereas use is still, Now, in terms of risk, we see that there's an inverse relationship between the use and the risk. So legalization tends to increase cannabis availability, but decrease perceived risk. Now, here, what we did is that we did a model of, it's a regression model to predict the use of cannabis based on these indicators of availability and risk perception. And what we see that it fits perfectly. So the two factors are crucial in terms of predictors of cannabis use in the future. So when we know that legalization is going to increase availability and reduce the perceived risk, there are expectations that it might increase again the use of cannabis. Now, in general, the consumption of any drug is accounted by a small number of people who are basically consuming most of the quantity of that substance. And this is no exception to cannabis. Here we see that 20% of cannabis users, this was done for the United States, account for 80% of the quantities that were used. And this is the daily or near daily users, so those who are using every day or nearly every day. So the bulk of the consumption of cannabis is accounted by daily and near daily users of cannabis. And why this is important? Because we see that there has been the increase in the past month users, but also in the daily and near daily users has been much more pronounced for this than for annual users. So this is why it's worrying, basically. And this is even more striking in Colorado. I'm sorry, because there is, it seems that the circles have moved, or the data have moved. So as you say, the increase is very much more for this than for annual. And it's more pronounced in Colorado, where there was one of the first states to legalize. So what that means? That means that even if at a national level or even a state level, the prevalence, this is the number of users who have used in the last year, is increasing or stable or increasing slightly, doesn't mean much, because in fact, what's happening here is that those who are consuming the most, the daily and nearly daily users, are increasing a lot. So there is a change in the distribution of the users, basically. It would seem that might be correlated. I say might be, because I think we need many more years of monitoring, might be correlated to the, of course, increased availability of cannabis and legalization. Now, if I move to the states that have legalized, so the two first states that have legalized, Washington State and Colorado, we see here that now we have more cannabis outlets than McDonald's or Starbucks in both states. And we also see that this, in spite of legalization, we estimate that there's still 33% in Washington and 40% in Colorado of the total cannabis sales that would be coming from the illicit cannabis market still. So it's not all supplied by the legal market. So there is still a black market that is remaining. Why? To avoid taxes, because the taxes are very high. So there is no, it would seem that there is no suppression of the illicit market. In terms of who is involved, I mean, it's not the EPs of the 60s or the 70s anymore. Now we have people from Yale who have an MBA. Hedge funds are investing in this new cannabis industry. There is also the development of a number of products, a number of edibles too, and some are targeting youth. So there is active marketing, as for any other consumption goods. Also diversification, and as you say, it's very attractive, very colorful, is also targeting the youth. Here also we can see sweets, cakes, a range of cannabis products that are marketed as any other goods and very attractive in the US. Here. Other examples, even some vouchers for $1 cannabis joint with your ski pass, so things like that. An imitation of well-known brands, such as Nutella, etc. Now, what is very worrying, even more, I'd say, is the development of products that are very potent, that are very high in terms of THC content. Up to 90% THC content in some of these waxes or oil that are now available on the market. And if we compare to the potency in the US in terms of THC content of natural cannabis product in the USA, compared with an average of 12% now, and 20 years ago it was about 6%. So it's much, much higher. And also accidental ingestion, perhaps by those who don't know, in doses, etc., may lead to some fatal emergencies. Now, here, and so this was about products. Now, in terms of legalization, there has been also an effect on the price. The price at both at retail level and at wholesale level. So, 1 minute, yeah. So here, this is the data about Washington, the Washington state. So the first stores opened there in July 2014, and the price then was $25 per gram after taxes. In April 2015, it had fallen by 2 to $12. And in January 2016, so 18 months after, it was less than $10 per gram. So it's a reduction of 60% in 1.5 years. In Colorado, we see the same. The price there is for an eighth of an ounce, so it's 3.5 grams. This is the most common purchase quantity there in Colorado. And it fell from around $60 for this quantity in mid-2014, when also the first store opened, to $25.40 in November 2015. So it's also a big reduction of 50% in 1.5 years. Of course, with the increase in the sales of cannabis, there is also increase in the taxes, in the revenue from the taxes, because these products are heavily taxed. In 2014 in Colorado, the businesses sold about $313 million of recreational cannabis and $387 million through the medical system. And in 2015, we estimate that there were about 600 million in total, both medical and recreational, that were sold. Only recreational, so it increased, and another 400 million for medical. So basically $1 billion in sales for the year 2015. So after the first year of implementation. And the first year they collected 56 million in taxes for recreational cannabis, and in 2015 it was about 115 million in total in taxes. So this is quite high. In Washington State, it's more or less the same data. It looks very high, but in fact, when we compare to the budget of the state of Colorado, it's a minor proportion. It's less than 1%. Is half a percent, basically. So relatively small, still. Now, here, because I'm going to try to go through a number of indicators on the possible impact of the legislation in Colorado, because Colorado is where we have the most data, basically, and there is also monitoring in place to see what's happening with legislation and the impact. So I wanted first to show you the different steps in the move away from full prohibition in Colorado, starting with medical marijuana in 2011, then the legalization of possession in Denver only in 2005, the first marijuana stores in 2007, 2008, and by 2009 there were already 700 stores for medical marijuana. It's all for medical marijuana now. And then for recreational cannabis, it was legalized in 2012, and this is in 2014 that recreational stores open. So the first indicator we wanted to look at is the hospitalizations that are related to cannabis in Colorado over time. And we see there is an increase over time. And we see there is, you can see a clear increase in 2010. And this is after there were so many, basically, shops shops or dispensaries where you could get the medical marijuana. And then in 2014, when there were the first shops selling recreational cannabis, then there is also a major increase. So there may be some links here with medical marijuana and with legalization of recreational cannabis. Then we looked at emergency room visits in Colorado related to cannabis. Here we have data for 2011, 2014. There is a gradual increase. We need to see, perhaps on a long term, whether it's related to legalization and medical cannabis or not. I don't know, but this is increasing. So, in terms of health issues. We also looked at heavy cannabis use in those in cannabis treatment. So the share of the people in treatment for cannabis in Colorado that are reporting heavy use. That means more than 20 days a month. So we see also a sort of big increase between 2009 and 2010 when there was medical marijuana that was widely available. And then again, then the increase, it was a bit of flattening, and then the increase continues with legalization, basically. But it's not, I mean, this is quite, the proportion is very high. It's 36% of those in treatment for cannabis, in treatment for cannabis are reporting heavy use, so it's a very high proportion altogether. Now, we looked at the cannabis in the urine of young people, aged 10 to 17. So recreational cannabis is not allowed for this age range. This is only from 21 and above in the state of Colorado. But we see that there has been a gradual increase, and perhaps more marked in 2013, about positive urine tests for cannabis in youth under 18. So this is also something that needs to be monitored. Here too, even if they don't have access, they are not supposed to have access to the shops selling recreational cannabis or to medical marijuana. They may get them for other people, for friends, for family members, etc. Knowing that this is happening in a context where norms may be changing, and then where cannabis may be perceived as less risky, and there are advertisements everywhere, basically. We also looked at emergency calls to poison control centers, and those in particular that are related to cannabis. When we look on the left, these are the data for general population. And yes, there is an increase in 2010. So after the medical marijuana was perhaps more widely implemented, but the big step is in 2014 with all the recreational, the shops for recreational marijuana. And we see also that this is mirrored also in young children, children between 0 and 8. There are a lot of reports of, multiplied by 10 between 2006 and 2015 for children, so from 4 to 50 basically. So it's not little, the increase. And I've shown you some of the products. They're very attractive, and they look like sweets, cakes, etc. And they are, in fact. And children may just accidentally ingest these, and then they end up in poison control centers. Now, here we looked at the deaths that are related to car accidents, so impaired driving, and that also related to cannabis, of course, marijuana. So if we look in terms of the share of the death related to car accidents that are related to cannabis, the share has multiplied by more than 3 over the years between 2006 and 2015, from 7% of the car accidents of the deaths by car accident where cannabis was in cause in 2006 to 21% in 2015. So also this is quite alarming. In terms of numbers too, numbers is the graph on the left. You see also this increase, and there's perhaps a bit more steep since legalization. And on the right top, you see also the increase in Washington. On the same, they were increased by 100%, basically. They were multiplied by 2 between 2013 and 2014 in terms of the share of the cannabis-related death by car accident. Now, we're also wondering whether this use of cannabis and consumption of cannabis is related to the use of other drugs and also alcohol. So we look at over the years. Here, it's very broad. It's like 40 years. And what we see clearly is that there's not much correlation between cannabis use and what I wanted to say, no, sorry. Yes, I think, Yes, there seems to be, no, in fact, yeah, I'm sorry. I think I will miss this slide because, I think, I wanted to, I think there is a mess in the, in the correlation, in the correlation factors. But what we saw is that there is a positive correlation between cannabis and alcohol in the United States, which would seem to act as a complement in some cases. And when we look at Colorado, in the last 2010-12 and then compare 2013-15, so before basically and after the legalization, there has been an increase in the consumption of alcohol. So here also we need to look at this a bit more in depth to see if this may be linked also to the increase in the cannabis consumption, and especially in heavy users, and the legalization also in particular. We also look at what's happening with the potency, so the content in THC of cannabis. I'm talking about now the material, not the edibles, etc., but the herbal material. In the United States, there is not much resin there. It's mostly all herb. When we look at the imported cannabis, so the cannabis from abroad, non-domestic federal seizures, there has been an increase since the early 80s from 2% to 12, 13% now. So this is what we have. Most of the product there is about this potency. If we compare to Europe, in Europe, in average, cannabis herb is around, has also increased, and now is around between 8 and 10%. In average, of course, there is minimum and maximum range. And, but in the United States, we see these are the bars that are orange and blue. And we see that depending on the type of product, also the THC will differ widely. And as I mentioned before, where it's more important is in what we call Sinsemilla. So Sinsemilla is basically a type of herbal cannabis, which is the unfertilized female, flower buds from the female plants, and they are higher in THC, and also now they are much lower in CBD. And what I didn't say that, of course, not of course, but there were in none of the jurisdictions that legalized cannabis in the United States, they were put a threshold for the maximum potency allowed. And basically what we saw is that while prices decreased, potency also increased. And now the average in Colorado and Washington is around 70%. 17, but also see data for 20%. So it depends on the source, but it's quite high. It's much higher than the rest of the country, on average, for herbal material. Now we look also at interdiction, so seizures of cannabis that is originating in Colorado, in other states, basically in the United States. And you see there is a steep increase after the commercialization of medical marijuana from 2010. And then there is another increase after the legalization of recreational cannabis. And this cannabis that is basically is produced in Colorado legally, some of it finds its way in other states in the United States, is being exported. And here, you have a map of the different seizures of cannabis from Colorado, that the cases that were intercepted in the rest of the United States. So it goes everywhere, basically, in the United States. We see also an augmentation, an increase in the, especially with legal recreational cannabis, in the number of parcels containing marijuana, which are basically mailed from Colorado to other states. So of course they would all contain, most of them would contain little quantities, but still, I mean, there is an increase, and the steep increase was in 2015 after all the shops were set up in 2014 in Colorado. Now, we look also at the seizures of cannabis in United States to see if there were a change in the distribution of the origin of the cannabis being seized in United States. And we saw that there is a clear decrease now in the seizures at the border with Mexico. So there is less cannabis from Mexico being imported into the United States. And when we look at Mexico, this is the cultivation of opium poppy and production of opium, and I mean to manufacture heroin in Mexico. And we see that there has been markedly increasing since 2014. And the reports we have is that farmers are now switching. So Mexico is known for the production of cannabis and production of opium and heroin. And farmers now would be switching in Mexico to opium production because it's becoming more profitable than cannabis, with basically being produced in some states in the United States and in others too. And so this would be a sort of a bit far away, but might be a consequence of legalization, in fact. So we need to look at that. And here, when we look at the green bars, this is Mexican origin for the heroin on the US market. And you see that it has been markedly increasing since a law in 2003, and now it's. I mean, it looks like it's 80% of the US and of the US market. And before, it was mostly originating from South America. That means Colombia, basically, yeah? Because Colombia is the other producer of heroin in the continent. So, and it seems that there's an acceleration in 2014. So this is also something that needs to be followed. And perhaps in conclusion, I would say that we have looked at the data available, but there are a lot of data that are not available, and it's extremely difficult to draw serious conclusions about the link between legalization and also what's happening in terms of impact and, I mean, causal relations, basically, are very difficult to show. We will need many more years of monitoring of a number of indicators across the board to assess possible impacts in terms of the legalization, in terms of public health, individual health, safety, security, and also the market dynamics, and the market dynamics between the legal product and what remains illegal. And this should be done both in the states that have legalized and also in the other states, because there might be an impact also in other states. So we are looking forward to get all this data. Now, what I want to say also is that not all the states that have legalized have set up a system to monitor basically the impact and have the data, I mean, the data monitoring in place to look at that. So this is also a challenge. In Uruguay, the implementation is a bit different. There is, for example, a maximum potency allowed, 15%. Also, a price has been determined. There is a system of selling through pharmacies that is being set up. So it's a bit different. But we wait also for this to be fully implemented and to see if there are also data about that. In Canada, legalization is also current. I mean, has been decided, but now it's for all the provinces. They have a year until July 2018 to define a sort of plan, implementation plan. And they will also differ. I have read in the press, for example, that some provinces are more going to perhaps a more free market than others, etc. So also this will be very important to monitor. Now, I suggest you look, if you're more interested, or interested to have more details about implementation legalization, you look in the annex of the World Drug Report, where there is a table that details the particulars of the different states in the implementation of the legalization. Thank you very much.